African American is a bogus PC made-up term.
Yep.
I mean, that's not a race. That is, your ancestry is from Africa, and now you live in America.
That is Glenn Beck there, the Fox News Channel host and the talk radio host, putting his own We Are the World spin on question number 9 from this year's United States Census form. As we highlighted this week, question 9 on the census form asks, what is person 1's race? Your possible answers include white, American Indian or Alaska Native, or black, African American, or Negro. And before you ask, no, I do not know if Mr. Beck is more comfortable saying the word Negro than he is saying the word African American. It doesn't seem like the Census Bureau is actually all that comfortable with its use of the word Negro on the census form. But they do have a relatively cogent explanation for what it's doing there. The Census Bureau's Public Information Office told us today that in the last census, in the year 2000, over 56,000 Americans wrote in the word Negro specifically, even though that word was printed there alongside African American and black on the checkbox, just like it is on this year's form. That said, the census also told us today that they are exploring the prospect of dropping this word from the form for 2020. This year, they'll test the effect of removing the term Negro from the form. They'll send about 30,000 homes forms that don't have the term listed as a pre-written option. See what happens. Joining us now live from the great city of New Orleans is Melissa Harris-Lacewell, Associate Professor of Politics and African American Studies at Princeton. Melissa, thanks very much for joining us.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
On Twitter today, you unscientifically polled people on what the word Negro made them think of. What kind of responses did you get?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm a public opinion researcher, and this is clearly the least scientific poll I have ever done. But I was interested just because, you know, there's this sort of advocacy position saying that Negro is necessarily a derogatory term. And I was just sort of interested. Do people respond to it necessarily in a derogatory manner? And in fact, that's not what I got at all. Some people had sort of cultural references saying things like Negro spirituals or Negro League baseball. Some people, in fact, had a very positive political historical memory of it, saying that Negro was, after all, the common term in usage during the Civil Rights Movement. So there's a way in which one could say that most of the important 20th century efforts towards civil rights happened because Negroes did it, because African American, Afro-American, and black became sort of common usage after the Civil Rights Movement. So in that sense I saw, but of course there were also people who said Negro made them think about segregation, made them think about antiquated terms, and possibly even derogatory ways of talking about black people.
David Wilson was on the show, David Wilson of the Grio, on the show this week, and he said that he thinks it's possible that the word will be offensive enough and strange enough to a lot of younger African Americans that it might actually hurt their participation in the census. Do you think, there's no real way to measure that, but do you think that's possible?
Well, the fact is that there are good ways to measure it. You know, one of the things about census folks is they're not perfect at everything, but they are mighty good at pre-testing questions. And that's part of what they're up to here with this 30,000 folks in a sample to see whether or not there is a response rate difference. In other words, if you take it off the form, you end up with a different kind of response rate or different sorts of people responding than you do when you leave it on the form. So in a certain way, it's an empirical question, and we'll have an answer to it later. But it was funny, my first tweeting about this happened when I did see David on talking about this with you, because I think there are real issues about the census, about undercounting and underrepresentation of African Americans that we should be concerned about. And for me, Negro doesn't make the top 10 of those concerns. In fact, I almost felt like saying, Negro, please.
I do actually think this is sort of more interesting than it is controversial, right? Yeah. I mean, there have been people on the right who've tried to make the census controversial this year, raising the specter that it's some kind of big brother intrusion or something. But yeah. I mean, the census is really important. Getting undercounted in the census materially affects your political representation in this country. So is there not some sort of a risk to being scared of or offended by the census?
Maybe, but again, if we think about the biggest issues issues facing race and representation around the census. The first thing I would say is, because I'm a professor, I have a reading list for everybody, and at the top of that reading list would be a terrific book by Melissa Nobles at MIT about the history of the census and issues of race in both the U.S. and Brazil, which are an interesting case about how we develop the very concept of blackness and who gets counted as black or as brown or as mulatto in these various categories. But I think what we really need to be asking is, at this particular historic moment, what happens when we count, for example, incarcerated persons who are disproportionately people of color, when we count them in the counties where they're incarcerated rather than in the home communities from which they hail? So that, for example, in a state like Illinois, you end up with young African American and Latinos being counted disproportionately in predominantly white downstate counties and not in the very neighborhoods from which they come. And of course that then affects political representation. It affects federal dollars. There are millions of dollars at stake here, and what we want to be doing is encouraging African Americans, blacks and Negroes to be filling out the survey, not to be sort of raising a specter of anxiety. Still, it is important and it's interesting and it's worth asking sort of what does it mean when a community of people who have been typically underrepresented and marginalized, when they want to name themselves. And what happens if these sort of historic names, these names that still may carry a great deal of negative baggage, if they push off exactly the people we're trying to count and trying to create more equity and fairness for?
Melissa Harris-Lacewell, Associate Professor of Politics and African American Studies at Princeton University, the perfect person to talk to about this. I knew you'd have the academic rigor of the pre-testing thing down. Thank you very much, Melissa. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the McCain-Palin 2008 campaign manager is offloading some merciless truth on Sarah Palin. Do you remember in Sarah Palin's book, the campaign staffer she attacked for his weight and said that he swore too much? Well, now that campaign staffer has some memories of Sarah Palin to share with all of us from the campaign trail. Stand by.